My cousins laughed when they got Grandpa's valuable land, and I got an old wooden chest. It all started with that old wooden box. If I had known then what was inside, my life would have changed a whole lot sooner. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name's Thomas Reed. Tom to everyone who knows me. 45 years old, auto mechanic. And at that time, proud owner of the most stubborn radiator leak in Carson County. I was living in my late grandfather Jack's house on the outskirts of our dusty Nevada town, a place where even the tumbleweeds seemed to move in slow motion. The day everything changed, I was standing in Jack's old garage, my garage now, wiping grease off my hand with a rag that had seen better days. Old Crow Medicine Show's wagon wheel crackled to the speakers of the beat-up radio that had been sitting on that workbench since '98. The smell of oil and gasoline hung in the air like a familiar cologne. That house had been my home for almost 2 years by then. I'd moved in with Jack when his health started failing, leaving my crappy rented apartment behind. None of my cousins wanted to help the old man, said they were too busy with their important city jobs and growing families. But truthfully, they just didn't want to be bothered with an old man who talked about silver mines and desert treasures more than their quarterly bonuses. Jack passed away 6 months before that day in the garage. He'd gone peacefully in his sleep after telling me one last story about the time he thought he'd struck it rich back in '57, only to find out he'd been digging in someone else's claim. He laughed about it even then, decades later. "The journey's the real gold, Tommy," he'd said, patting my hand with his weathered one. "Remember that when I'm gone." After the funeral, the reading of the will had been like watching vultures circle a carcass. My cousins David and Michael had shown up with their lawyers, expecting to divide up Jack's modest empire. And divide they did, just not how they planned. Jack's will had been specific, surprisingly specific for a man who sometimes forgot what day of the week it was. The more valuable parcels of land he'd accumulated over his lifetime went to various cousins. But the house, with everything in it, came to me, to Tommy. The lawyer had read from Jack's will, who listened to an old man's stories when no one else would. David and Michael couldn't believe it. They'd expected the house too. It sat on a decent-sized lot that would have been perfect for development. Instead, they got empty desert acreage. Valuable, sure, but not what they'd been salivating over. "You're welcome to the house, Tommy," David had said afterward, car keys to his BMW dangling from his manicured fingers. "It's a money pit anyway, just like Grandpa's silver fantasies." They weren't entirely wrong about the money pit part. The roof leaked in 3 places. The plumbing made noises like a dying whale. The property taxes were brutal. And my auto repair business barely kept the lights on. Those fancy resort hotels being built outside town were killing small operations like mine. Their guests didn't come to Nevada to get their oil changed. The bank had been sending those fancy letters with words like foreclosure and default for months. Apparently, inheriting a house doesn't mean you can afford to keep it. I took a swig from my lukewarm Coke and grimaced. Nothing like flat soda at the end of a long day fixing other people's problems while your own life sits in neutral. "Tom, you're just like your grandfather, chasing ghosts and fairy tales." That's what Michael said the previous month when he stopped by unannounced in his shiny new pickup truck, supposedly to check on me. What he really wanted was to see if I'd finally given up, so he could buy the house for pennies before the bank took it. I wasn't as good with comebacks as Jack had been. He would have said something clever that would have sent Michael packing with his tail between his legs. Me? I just mumbled something about being busy and went back to fixing my truck's alternator. That wooden box had been sitting on top of my bedroom closet since Jack died. He'd mentioned it a few times in his final days, his voice growing hushed and serious. "There's treasure in there, Tommy," he'd whispered from his hospital bed, oxygen mask fogging with each labored breath. "Not the kind they can take from you." I'd nodded then, humoring a dying man. I figured it was full of old love letters to my grandmother or maybe childhood drawings I'd made. Sentimental stuff, valuable only to the heart. I hadn't even bothered to open it after the funeral. Grief has a funny way of making you put things off. Then life took over, bills needed paying, and the box just sat there collecting dust. The radio switched songs to Sweet Child O' Mine, and suddenly I was 17 again, stepping on Ellie Parker's toes at the spring fling dance. She was wearing a blue dress that matched her eyes, and I was wearing a rented tux that smelled faintly of the previous renter's cologne. When I crushed her foot during guitar solo, my face turned redder than Mom's apple pie cooling on the windowsill. Ellie just laughed it off, said she'd forgive me if I brought her some punch. That laugh, like wind chimes on a summer evening. I hadn't heard anything like it since. Mom's apple pies. Now there was something worth remembering. The whole house would smell like cinnamon and sugar for days. Neighborhood kids would mysteriously appear on our porch on baking days, like they had some kind of dessert radar. Mom would pretend to be annoyed, but always cut extra slices. She died 8 years before Jack, taking her recipe to the grave despite my pathetic attempts to recreate it. Some things can't be inherited, I guess. I reached up to the wall where I kept a few family photos I'd saved from the cousin's raid. There was my favorite picture of Jack and me, standing in front of his ancient Ford pickup, the desert stretching behind us like an ocean of sand and secrets. I must have been about 12. Jack had his arm around my shoulders, both of us laughing because the camera timer had gone off early, catching us by surprise. That truck had been our spaceship, our time machine, our faithful steed. We'd driven it all over the Nevada backcountry, Jack pointing out rock formations and teaching me how to read the land, like a book written by God himself. Tommy, you just got to learn the language. The year I spent living with Jack before he died was worth more than the 20 years before it. Every evening, we'd sit on the porch with cheap beers, and he'd tell me stories about his prospecting days in the 50s and 60s. Silver veins running to the Nevada desert, like God's own lightning frozen in stone. He'd say, eyes twinkling with the memory. The weird thing was, I never got tired of those stories, even when he told the same ones multiple times. There was something about Jack's voice, his belief in possibilities, that made even the most far-fetched tales seem like gospel truth. The real treasure is what can't be stolen. Jack used to say, usually after a few too many Pabst Blue Ribbons. Remember that, Tommy. Men like your cousins, they think wealth is what you can count. But real wealth is what counts to you. At the time, I thought it was just another one of Jack's fortune cookie philosophies. But standing there in the garage, with nothing left to lose except the house itself, I was starting to think the old man might have been onto something. After Jack passed, I fell into a funk deeper than the silver mines he used to talk about. I barely left the house, except to work. I let friendships slide. I ordered pizza 3 nights a week and left the boxes piling up. Looking back, it was probably depression, but men like me didn't talk about that kind of thing. We just pushed through, like walking against the wind. That was probably why I never fought the cousins on the land distribution. My lawyer, if you could call him that, he mostly handled DUIs, said I might have a case, but I didn't have the energy for a legal battle. So I let them take what they wanted, keeping only what Jack had specifically left me. The house was quiet that evening, except for the hum of the old refrigerator and the occasional passing car. Friday night in a town that rolled up its sidewalks at 8 p.m., the loneliness hit me like a physical weight sometimes. No wife, no kids, no dog even. Just me and Jack's creaky house and a box full of who knows what's still sitting on my closet shelf. The radio DJ announced it was time for some John Mellencamp, and Jack and Diane started playing a song about 2 American kids growing up in the heartland. Growing up, but not necessarily growing wiser. That night, something shifted in me. Maybe it was a song, or maybe it was just time. I went inside the house, climbed on a chair, and pulled down Jack's wooden box from the top of my bedroom closet. It had been up there for 6 months, gathering dust while I gathered regrets. The box wasn't particularly fancy, just old, solid oak with a simple brass latch. It smelled like Jack's aftershave somehow, that Old Spice scent that always reminded me of Sunday dinners at his house when I was a kid. I ran my fingers over the box's worn surface, remembering how Jack's hands looked similar, weathered, cracked, but strong. Hands that had dug into the earth searching for treasure while somehow managing to hold our family together. If dreams are disease, I said to myself, then I'm terminal. Jack used to say something similar, usually after another failed expedition. He'd come home dusty and empty-handed, but somehow still smiling. If hope is foolish, Tommy, then I'm the biggest fool in Nevada, and proud of it. The bank was giving me 30 more days before they'd start formal foreclosure proceedings. My savings account looked like a bad joke, and the garage business was barely keeping the lights on. Maybe, just maybe, there was something in this box that could help. Or maybe I just needed to connect with Jack one more time. I placed the box on my bed and wiped sweat from my forehead with my forearm, leaving another grease stain I'd probably never notice. Like Jack always said, a clean mechanic is a mechanic who ain't fixed nothing. The house needed a new roof. My truck needed a new transmission. I needed a new life. And all I had was this box that Jack had been so mysterious about in his final days. I picked up the photo of Jack and me by the truck, once more, running my thumb over his laughing face. Jack, I whispered to the empty room, if you're up there watching, how about a sign? Just a little hint that I'm not being as crazy as everyone thinks. The house creaked and settled, as if in response. Probably just a foundation shifting. Another thing on my endless-to-fix list. With a deep breath that tasted like dust and motor oil, I made my decision. It was time to open the box and face whatever Jack had left me. If it was just old receipts and childhood drawings, so be it. But if there was something more... I set the photo down next to the box and stared at the brass latch. 45 years old, and still hoping for buried treasure, like a kid with a plastic shovel at the beach. But then again, Jack always said hope wasn't something you outgrew. It was something you cultivated, like a garden in difficult soil. The day you stop believing in possibilities, Tommy, he'd say, tipping his worn baseball cap back on his head, is the day you start dying no matter what your body's doing. I flipped open the latch and lifted the lid. I flipped open the brass latch and lifted the lid of Jack's wooden box. The hinges creaked like they were telling secrets, releasing the scent of old paper and memories trapped in time. Inside, neatly organized, which surprised me, since Jack was never neat about anything except his prospecting tools, were stacks of yellowed papers, faded photographs, and what looked like old receipts. I carried the box out to the garage where the light was better. The single bulb hanging from the ceiling cast shadows across my workbench as Bob Seger's Night Moves played softly on the radio. Some DJ somewhere must have been feeling nostalgic that night. Made two of us. The first few items were exactly what I'd expected. Old love letters from Jack to my grandmother Sarah, written while he was away on one of his prospecting trips. His handwriting was surprisingly elegant for a man with hands as rough as sandpaper. I set those aside, feeling like I was intruding on something private. Even after all these years, there were photographs I'd never seen before. Jack as a young man standing proudly next to a mine entrance, his arm around a buddy whose name was scrawled on the back. Me and Jimmy Colson, Ruby Mountains, 1949. Their faces were streaked with dirt, but their smiles could have lit up Vegas. Deeper in the box, I found what looked like official documents, deeds, claims, surveys. Most were for parcels of land I didn't recognize, probably sold off decades ago when Jack needed cash. My grandfather had been land rich, but dollar poor for most of his life, always betting his last cents on the next big strike. Then, at the bottom of the stack, I found something different. It wasn't a deed or a letter or a photo. It was a map, hand-drawn on thick, yellowed paper that crackled when I unfolded it. The map showed a section of what I recognized as the Ruby Mountains, about 60 miles northeast of town. Jack had marked trails, elevations, and landmarks in his distinctive handwriting, adding little notes in the margins like, "Good water here," and "Watch for rattlers." But what caught my eye was a spot marked with a faded red X and the words "Silver Vein, 1953" scrawled next to it. Around the X, he'd drawn what looked like a geological cross-section, showing layers of rock with one bright vein running through it. I stared at the map, my heart doing a weird flutter in my chest. This wasn't just one of Jack's tall tales or exaggerated memories. This was something he'd documented, something specific enough that it might actually be real. In the corner of the map, Jack had written a note that made my throat tight. For Tommy, when he's ready to find his own treasure. May he have better luck than his old grandpa. He dated it just 3 months before he died. Growing up with Jack's stories, I'd learned to take them with a grain of salt. The fish was always bigger, the silver vein always richer, the adventure always more harrowing in his retellings. But looking at this map, with its careful measurements and precise landmarks, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, the old man had been telling the truth all along. I remembered summer evenings when Jack would grill hot dogs on his ancient Weber, and we'd sit on lawn chairs watching the stars come out over the desert. He'd point up at constellations, telling me how the old prospectors used them to navigate. "The stars don't lie, Tommy," he'd say, "unlike people in treasure maps." But this map, this one felt different. It wasn't some fancy parchment with X marks the spot like in the movies. It was practical, detailed, the work of someone who knew the land intimately. I rummaged the box further and found a small leather journal. Inside, Jack had recorded his prospecting trips in the same elegant handwriting, including the one where he'd found the silver vein marked on the map. June 18th, 1953. Found what might be the real deal today. Good silver content in the samples. Limited exposure at surface, but angle suggests larger deposit below. Need capital for proper equipment. Location recorded on separate map for security. My heart was racing now. If this was real, if Jack had actually found a significant silver deposit, why hadn't he developed it? Why die with barely 2 nickels to rub together if he knew where millions might be buried? I flipped through more journal entries and found my answer several pages later. October 3rd, 1953. Had to sell mineral rights to Harmon's claim to cover Sarah's hospital bills. Kept the eastern parcel. Someday I'll go back. The silver's waited millions of years. It can wait a few more for me. Jack never went back. Life, bills, responsibilities, they have a way of derailing even the best laid plans. By the time my grandmother recovered, Jack had taken a steady job at the rail yard to provide stability. Later, when he might have had time to return, his knees and back were too far gone for serious prospecting. But he'd kept the map, kept the dream alive. And now, somehow, it had passed me. I needed help understanding what I was looking at. The geological markings might as well have been hieroglyphics to me. I fixed engines, not mountain ranges. But I knew someone who might be able to make sense of it all. Ellie Parker, the girl whose toes I'd crushed at the spring fling dance, was now the head librarian at Carson County Library. With minor in geology she'd picked up during a brief flirtation with becoming a park ranger. We'd gone our separate ways after high school, me to community college and then the family business, her to university, and then back home when her mom got sick. I'd seen her around town occasionally over the years, exchanged pleasantries at the grocery store or the annual 4th of July barbecue. Each time, I'd felt that same flutter I'd felt as a teenager, followed by the same certainty that someone like her wouldn't be interested in someone like me. The next morning, I showered, shaved, and put on my least-stained jeans and a button-up shirt that hadn't seen the light of day since my cousin's wedding 3 years earlier. Looking in the mirror, I hardly recognized myself without a layer of grease somewhere on my face or arms. I carefully placed Jack's map in a folder and headed to the library. Carson County Library was housed in an old brick building downtown, one of the few structures left from the town's brief mining boom in the early 1900s. Inside, it smelled like old books, furniture polish, and the coffee from the small cart near the entrance. I found Ellie at the reference desk, her dark hair now streaked with bits of silver that caught the light when she moved. She wore glasses now, small rectangular ones that somehow made her blue eyes look even brighter than I remembered. She was helping an elderly man look up something on the computer, her patience evident as she slowly explained how to use the mouse. When she looked up and saw me standing there awkwardly clutching my folder, her eyebrows rose in surprise, followed by a smile that knocked 20 years off my emotional age. "Tom Reed," she said, finishing up with the elderly gentleman. "I was beginning to think you were allergic to books." I managed a smile that probably looked more like a grimace. "Only the ones without pictures," I replied, immediately regretting the lame joke. But Ellie laughed, that same wind chime laugh from high school, and my nerves settled a bit. She led me to a quiet study room in the back of the library, away from the few other patrons browsing the shelves. "So, what brings the best mechanic in Carson County to my humble domain?" she asked, sitting across from me at a small table. Car manual research? Or are you finally returning that copy of Catcher in the Rye you borrowed in 11th grade? I'd forgotten about that book. It was probably still in a box somewhere in Jack's attic. Our attic. I need your help with something, I said, opening the folder, something my grandfather left me. I carefully unfolded the map and smoothed it out on the table between us. Ellie leaned forward, her glasses slipping slightly down her nose as she examined it. "This is Jack's handwriting," she said, not really asking. Everyone in town had known Jack. "Is this the Ruby Mountain section?" I nodded, impressed. "You can tell just by looking?" "I hike there sometimes," she said, tracing the contour lines with her finger. "These formations are pretty distinctive. Plus, it says Ruby Mountains right here." She pointed to Jack's neat label in the corner. Smiling at me, I felt my face warm. Of course it did. I'd been so focused on the X that I'd missed the obvious. Jack thought he found silver there. I explained, pointing to the red mark. "Back in the 50s, I found this in a box of his things, along with some journal entries that seemed to back it up." Ellie studied the map more closely, her forehead creasing in concentration. "These markings here, they're Geological Survey notations. Your grandfather knew what he was doing." She glanced up at me. "Did he ever develop this claim?" I shook my head and explained about my grandmother's hospital bills, how Jack had to sell most of his rights, but kept this eastern parcel. "So the land might still be in your family?" she asked, her eyes widening slightly. "I don't know," I admitted. "That's part of what I need help figuring out." For the next 3 hours, Ellie and I dug through county records, property archives, and geological surveys. She showed me how to access digitized records on the library computers, her shoulder occasionally brushing against mine as she leaned over to type something. Each contact sent a jolt through me that had nothing to do with the potential buried treasure we were researching. We discovered that Jack had indeed maintained ownership of the parcel marked on the map until his death. The mineral rights had transferred along with the land title, which meant they'd been part of his estate, part of what should have been divided among the heirs. "But there's no mention of this specific parcel in the will documents you showed me," Ellie said, frowning at the screen. "Just a general bequest of all remaining properties not specifically disposed of to your cousins." "They got everything except the house and its contents," I confirmed, feeling a sinking sensation. If the map was part of contents, but the land had gone my cousins, I was back at square one. But Ellie wasn't giving up. She dug deeper, finding a survey from the State Geological Office dated 1954 that mentioned promising silver deposits in exactly the area Jack had marked. "Look at this," she said, pulling up a scanned document. "Your grandfather filed an affidavit of labor in 1954, proving he'd done development work on the claim. That established his ownership under the mining laws at the time. But here's the interesting part. He filed under Reed Family Holdings, not his individual name." I stared at the document, not quite understanding the significance. "Tom," Ellie said, her voice excited, "this might mean the claim was technically held by a family trust or entity, not just by Jack personally. If that entity still exists and wasn't specifically transferred in the will." My pulse quickened. Then it might still be in limbo, not automatically part of what went to my cousins. She nodded, her eyes bright with the thrill of the chase. "We need to check if there are any records of Reed Family Holdings still being active, if it was never formally dissolved." We spent another hour searching through business entity records, but found nothing conclusive. The trail went cold after 1968, when Nevada changed its reporting requirements for small family businesses. "I need to consult some more specialized sources," Ellie finally said, sitting back and rubbing her eyes beneath her glasses. "Mining claim laws from the 50s are complex, and there have been several changes since then that might affect ownership." I checked my watch, shocked to discover it was already past closing time. The library had emptied around us while we'd been lost in our research. "I'm sorry," I said, starting to gather the papers. "I didn't realize how late it got. You probably have plans." Ellie shook her head, a small smile playing around her lips. "My exciting Friday night plans involved a frozen dinner and reruns of the Great British Baking Show." She hesitated, then added, "There's a diner across the street still open. We could grab something to eat and keep talking. If you want." My heart did that teenage flutter thing again. "I'd like that," I said, trying to sound casual. "But fair warning, I still eat like I'm fueling up for a football game, despite having the metabolism of a 45-year-old mechanic." She laughed. "I've seen you put away 3 plates at the town barbecue. I think I can handle it." At the diner, under the buzzing fluorescent lights and surrounded by the smell of coffee and pie, Ellie and I talked like we were picking up a conversation we'd left off just yesterday, not 27 years ago. She told me about college, her brief marriage to a professor that ended amicably when they realized they wanted different things, her return to care for her mother who'd since passed. I told her about my failed attempts to expand the garage, my brief stint trying to make it in Vegas as a casino mechanic, and how I come home when Jack's health started failing. "You were always a good grandson," she said, stirring her coffee. "Jack talked about you all the time when he'd come to the library, always bragging about how you could fix anything with an engine." He exaggerated. I said, feeling warm spread to my chest that had nothing to do with the bad diner coffee. Jack saw the best in everyone, especially family. "Not everyone," Ellie corrected. "He had your cousin's number. Used to call them those vultures in waiting when they weren't around." We both laughed, and for a moment it felt like Jack was there with us, enjoying the joke. "Do you really think there could be something to this map?" I asked after a while, voicing the doubt I've been carrying all day. Or am I just being as crazy as everyone always said Jack was? Ellie considered me thoughtfully. "The Geological surveys support his findings. Silver prices are higher now than they've been in decades. And if that claim is still somehow yours." She shrugged. "Even if it's a long shot, don't you owe it to Jack to find out? At 45, aren't I a little old to be chasing treasure maps?" I asked, half joking. "Better than being 45 and not chasing anything," she responded. "Besides, if it doesn't pan out, you can always open that taco stand you mentioned wanted to start in high school." I nearly choked on my coffee. "You remember that? That was just a joke after I bombed my SATs. I remember a lot of things about you, Tom Reed," she said softly, and the look in her eyes made me wish I'd kept in better touch over the years. After dinner, I walked Ellie to her car, the night air cool against my face. She promised to keep digging into the legal status of the claim and call me if she found anything. "Thank you," I said, suddenly awkward again, "for today, for helping, for remembering the taco stand thing." She smiled and, in a move that would replay in my mind for days afterward, stood on tiptoe and kissed my cheek. "Jack believed in you," she said. "Maybe it's time you did too." I watched her drive away, then walked to my own truck, Jack's map safely tucked in its folder under my arm. The stars were out in force, the way they only get in small towns far from city lights. Heading home, I kept thinking about what Ellie had said, about what Jack might have left me, about second chances at things I'd given up on long ago. When I got back to the house, I spread the map out on the kitchen table and stared at it under the yellow light. The red X seemed to pulse with possibility. "If this is madness," I whispered to the empty kitchen, "then I'm all in." I didn't know what my next steps would be, or if there was any real chance of claiming what Jack had found all those years ago. But for the first time in years, I felt something I'd almost forgotten how to feel. Hope. And it tasted a lot better than flat Coke and regret. When you spend your whole life playing it safe, going all in feels like jumping off a cliff with a homemade parachute. But that's exactly what I did the Monday after finding Jack's map. I took out a second mortgage on the house, using every bit of equity I had left. "If this all goes south, I'll just live in my pickup like some washed-up rock star," I told a loan officer, who looked at me like I'd sprouted a second head. He'd known my family for years, watched me carefully make minimum payments on everything. Now here I was, betting the house, literally, on a faded red X drawn by an old man who'd been dead for 6 months. The bank approved the loan with a reluctance, so thick you could spread it on toast. I think they only said yes because foreclosure proceedings would have been more paperwork than they wanted to deal with. Either way, I walked out with enough cash to hire a professional geologist to assess Jack's claim. Finding a geologist willing to trek out to a remote spot in the Ruby Mountains on the word of mechanic with a hand-drawn map wasn't easy. Most of the firms I called in Reno laughed me off or quoted prices that would have required a third mortgage. Finally, Ellie suggested I try Stan Kowalski, a retired geology professor who occasionally consulted for mining companies. Stan was 70 if he was a day, with a permanent squint from decades of studying rock formations and a cigar perpetually clamped between his teeth, lit or not depending on whether we were indoors. He drove a beat-up Jeep with more miles on it than my pickup, and he took Jack's map with the seriousness of a doctor reviewing test results. "I knew your grandfather," he told me as we bounced along a rutted dirt road toward the mountains, his unlit cigar bobbing with each word. Stubborn bastard, but he knew his rocks. If Jack said there was silver, there's a decent chance he wasn't full of hot air. The journey to the spot marked on Jack's map took almost 3 hours of driving, followed by a 2-mile hike that had my knees protesting every step. Stan, despite being old enough to collect Social Security for a decade, moved like a mountain goat, pausing only to point out geological features that meant nothing to me, but seemed to confirm we were on the right track. When we reached the coordinates, there wasn't much to see, just a rocky outcropping on a hillside scattered with scrub brush and twisted juniper trees. Stan pulled tools from his backpack, a small pick, magnifying glass sample bags, and devices I couldn't name, and got to work, occasionally grunting or muttering to himself. I sat on a boulder, watching clouds drift across the Nevada sky, and wondering if I'd just flush my future down the toilet. The mountains stretched out around us, indifferent to my financial anxieties. Jack had loved these mountains, said they had character, unlike the perfectly photogenic Sierra Nevadas that attracted all the tourists. After about an hour of Stan poking at rocks and taking samples, I couldn't stand the suspense anymore. "So," I asked, trying to sound casual, "am I crazy or did Jack actually find something?" Stan straightened up, his knees cracking like twigs, and turned to me with an expression I couldn't read. Then, slowly, a grin spread across his weathered face. "Your grandfather wasn't crazy," he said, holding up a piece of rock with a grayish streak running through it. "This is a high-grade silver, or sample. Based on what I'm seeing in this outcropping, there's a significant vein running through this hillside. The real question is how extensive it is beneath the surface." My heart practically stopped. "Are we talking about a few $1,000s worth, or—" Stan chuckled, finally lighting a cigar now that we were outdoors. "Son, if this vein goes as deep as I suspect it might, and if the concentration holds, we're talking millions. Maybe tens of millions, depending on current silver prices." I sat down hard on that boulder, my legs subtly unable to support my weight. Millions. The kind of money that could not only save Jack's house, but change my life entirely. The kind of money my cousins would kill for. "I'll need to run some proper tests," Stan continued, seemingly amused by my shock. "But based on 40 years in the field, I'd say your grandfather hit the jackpot. He just never had the capital to develop it properly." That night, I cranked Bruce Springsteen's Born to Run so loud on Jack's old stereo that the windows rattled. I danced around the garage like a fool, air guitar with a wrench, high on possibilities. For the first time since Jack died, hell, maybe for the first time in my adult life, I felt like I was standing on the edge of something amazing instead of the edge of a cliff. I called Ellie with the news, my words tumbling over each other in excitement. She laughed that wind chime laugh and said she'd known all along that Jack wouldn't have held on to that map without good reason. "Come over for dinner tomorrow," she said. "We'll celebrate and figure out next steps." Next steps. Right. Because finding silver was just the beginning. I still needed to confirm I legally owned the claim, secure permits for exploratory drilling, find investors or partners for development costs, and navigate a mountain of regulations. But before I could even start that process, reality came crashing down like a Nevada thunderstorm. The first raindrop hit when I visited the county clerk's office to check property records. The clerk, a thin woman with glasses chained around her neck, looked up from her computer with a frown that sent my stomach dropping to my boots. That parcel was indeed owned by Jack Reed, she confirmed. But according to our records, it transferred to David and Michael Reed 3 months ago as part of the estate settlement. That's impossible, I argued. I have the map and documents from Jack's personal effects. He left those specifically to me. She shrugged, sympathy in her eyes but firmness in her voice. The map might be yours, but the land it shows belongs to your cousins. It's all legal and recorded. I'm sorry. I drove to Ellie's house in a daze, the wipers slapping against a sudden downpour that matched my mood perfectly. The universe has a sick sense of humor sometimes. When I told her what I discovered, she went into full research mode, spreading legal books across her dining table, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. There might be a loophole, she said, flipping pages with determined energy. If Jack left you the map with clear intent, or if this Reed Family Holdings entity still exists legally. I loved her optimism, but reality was setting in like concrete. Even if there's a loophole, my cousins have better lawyers. They always have. The second thunderclap came the very next day. David showed up at my garage, stepping out his gleaming black BMW in a suit that probably cost more than my monthly income. His smile had all the warmth of a rattlesnake sunning itself on a rock. "Tommy," he said, looking around my workspace with barely disguised disgust. "Heard you've been poking around the old Reed property up in Ruby Mountains, making inquiries, hiring geologists. News travels fast in small towns, especially when you're asking questions about land that might be worth millions. Just following up on something Jack left me," I said, deliberately turning back to the carburetor I was rebuilding. Sentimental value. David's laugh could have frozen beer. "Sure, sentimental. That's why you mortgaged this dump to hire Stan Kowalski." He leaned against my workbench, uninvited. Stan called an old college buddy of his, who called a mining consultant, who happens to golf with me. I kept my face neutral, though my heart was racing. "Good for you." "Here's the deal, Tommy," David said, his voice dropping to business mode. "Whatever Jack thought he found up there, it's on my land now. My land. If there's silver, it's mine. If you try to contest ownership or trespass again, I'll bury you in legal fees before you ever see the inside of a courtroom." After he left, I put down my tools and walked outside, looking up at the cloud-streaked sky. The rain had stopped, but the air still smelled of wet sage and dust. What now? Give up? Let David win again? Jack's voice seemed to echo in my head. The real fight isn't about winning, Tommy. It's about not letting them see you quit. The third storm hit a week later. The local paper ran a story about potential mining development in the Ruby Mountain foothills, complete with quotes from environmental activists concerned about watershed damage. Suddenly, my quest for Jack Silver wasn't just a family feud. It was a public issue. Signs appear around town. Save our mountains and no to Reed mine. People I'd known my whole life, customers whose cars I'd fixed at discount rates, were giving me side-eye at the grocery store. Meanwhile, the bank sent a notice that they were reviewing my loan, concerned about developments affecting collateral value. As if the universe wanted to make absolutely sure I got the message, Jack's old pickup, which I'd been using since my regular truck was in pieces in the garage, broke down on the highway during another rainstorm. I ended up walking 3 miles in the downpour, soaked to the bone, cursing the heavens. Is this a sign, or am I just the unluckiest son of a gun in Nevada? I shouted at the empty road, rain dripping from my nose and chin. By the time I made it home, I was ready to throw in the towel. Called David, tell him he could have the silver, the house, the whole damn legacy. I was tired of fighting battles I couldn't win. And then I found the letter. I was digging through Jack's box again, looking for anything that might help my case, when I discovered a sealed envelope tucked into a secret compartment in the bottom of the box. My name was written on it in Jack's elegant script. Inside was a single sheet of paper, dated just weeks before he died. Tommy, if you're reading this, you found the map and maybe realize what it means. The silver is real. I found it when I was younger than you are now, but life got in the way of dreams, as it often does. But here's what I learned in my 82 years. The real treasure isn't the silver in that mountain. It's the stubbornness in your heart. The unwillingness to let go of what matters, even when smart money says you should. Your cousins will fight you. They've been waiting for me to die, so they could pick over whatever I left behind. They think wealth is something you count. But real wealth is what you fight for. I fought for this family when everyone said I was crazy to keep trying. Fight for what's yours, Tommy. Not just a silver, but the right to follow your own map, with love and faith in you, Jack. I read that letter 3 times, tears blurring my vision. Then I called Ellie that night. She came over with coffee, homemade cookies, and a determination that matched the fire Jack's letter had rekindled in me. We spread papers across my kitchen table, mapping out a battle plan like generals preparing for war. The environmental concerns are legitimate, Ellie said, munching a cookie. But they're also an opportunity. What if we propose a different kind of mining operation? Minimal impact, local labor, community profit sharing. I looked at her, this woman who'd come back into my life like she'd never left. You're remarkable, you know that? Most people would have run screaming from this mess. She smiled, reaching across the table to brush cookie crumbs from my shirt. Remember when we were 17 and we talked about driving to California in your beat-up Camaro? Just leaving everything behind and starting fresh. I remembered. We'd been at a bonfire party after graduation, slightly drunk on cheap beer and possibilities. We'd mapped our route down the coast, all the way to San Diego. But then her mom got sick and my dad lost his job, and reality intervened, as it tends to do. We never made it to California, I said softly. No, she agreed. But we're getting a second chance at an adventure now. A different one than we planned, but still. The way she looked at me then made me feel like that 17-year-old again, full of hope and stupid courage. I thought about Jack, who'd given away his last winter coat to a homeless man passing through town, saying he had plenty of ways to stay warm, but the stranger only had one. Jack had never given up on his dreams. He'd just adjusted them to fit the life he had, not the one he planned. Over the next 2 weeks, Ellie and I worked on a comprehensive proposal for what we called the Reed Family Heritage Project. It outlined an environmentally conscious mining operation that would include educational components, conservation efforts for surrounding lands, and scholarships for local kids interested in geology or environmental science. We consulted with Stan, who connected us with mining engineers who specialized in low-impact extraction. We talked to environmental consultants about watershed protection. I drained my savings account on legal fees, trying to find any angle to challenge David's ownership claim. The town council announced a public hearing to discuss the competing proposals, mine and David's more traditional and profitable approach. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday evening at the high school gymnasium, the only venue in town large enough to hold the expected crowd. I spent the day before the hearing in a state of near panic. What did I know about public speaking? About mining? About anything beyond fixing carburetors and keeping old engines running? Ellie found me in the garage, sitting in Jack's pickup, staring at nothing. You'll do fine, she said, sliding into the passenger seat, like she belonged there. Just speak from the heart. Tell them what this means to you, to Jack's memory. David will have charts and projections and fancy economic impact studies. I said, I have a hand-drawn map and a story about my grandfather. Yes, Ellie agreed, and that's exactly why you'll win. Because this isn't just about silver or money. It's about legacy. It's about the kind of community we want to be. The gymnasium was packed that night. David and his team sat on one side in matching suits, surrounded by glossy presentation boards and a PowerPoint setup. I sat on the other side in my cleanest jeans and a button-up shirt Ellie had ironed for me, Jack's map and letter carefully protected in a folder on my lap. David went first, his presentation slick and professional. Jobs, tax revenue, economic growth. The council members nodded along, impressed by the numbers, even as some of the audience held up their protest signs. When my turn came, my legs felt like they were filled with concrete as I walked the podium. The microphone squealed with feedback, making me wince. I'm not a public speaker, I began, my voice shakier than I'd have liked, or a businessman. Most of you know me as the guy who fixes your cars when they break down. Some of you probably think I'm crazy for fighting my cousin over a piece of desert that might not have anything valuable in it at all. I unfolded Jack's map, holding it up so everyone could see. My grandfather drew this map in 1953 when he found silver in the Ruby Mountains. He couldn't develop it then because my grandmother got sick and he needed steady work to pay the bills. But he never gave up on the dream. I told him about Jack, not just the silver, but the man, how he'd taught neighborhood kids to fish in the creek behind his house, how he'd kept the town's vehicles running during the bad recession in the 80s, often accepting payment in home-cooked meals or promises of future work, how he'd been the first to show up with his pickup when the Henderson family lost their home to fire, helping to salvage what could be saved. Jack Reed believed in this town. I said, my voice stronger now. He believed in taking care of the land and the people on it. That's why our proposal isn't just about extracting silver and making money. It's about doing it right. I explained our plan. The environmental safeguards, the community benefits, the scholarships. I didn't have David's polished delivery, but I had something he didn't, a lifetime of connections with the people in that room. I'd fix their cars, listen to their problems over the hood of a stubborn engine, help push them out of snowdrifts in winter. This isn't just my fight. I finished. It's about whether we let outside interests determine what happens to our home, or whether we make those decisions together, as a community that cares about more than just the bottom line. When I sat down, my shirt was soaked with nervous sweat. Ellie squeezed my hand at the table, her eyes shining with what looked like pride. The council asked questions for nearly an hour, most directed at the technical experts on both sides. Then the public comment period began. I braced myself for criticism, for people to point out all the flaws in my amateur plan. The first person to approach the microphone was Bill Simmons, who owned the hardware store. I've known the Reed family for 40 years, he said. Jack helped me build my first shop counter when I couldn't afford to hire a carpenter. Tom's kept my delivery truck running when it should have been in the junkyard. If Tom says he'll take care of the land, I believe him. One by one, townspeople stood up. Not all supported me. Several spoke passionately about protecting the mountains from any development, but many shared stories about Jack, about me, about what it meant to have local control over local resources. David's face grew stonier with each testimonial. His experts shifted uncomfortably, clearly not prepared for the community aspect of the debate. The council adjourned without making a decision, promising to review both proposals and reconvene in 2 weeks. As people filed out, many stopped to pat my shoulder or shake my hand. David left quickly, surrounded by his consultants, not making eye contact with anyone. Later that night, I stood in Jack's backyard, my backyard, looking up at the stars. The same stars Jack had taught me to navigate by on our camping trips. The same stars that had watched over this land for billions of years before any Reed staked a claim to it. The battle wasn't over. David had money, legal resources, and a solid claim to the land. The environmental concerns were real and wouldn't be easily dismissed. The bank was still threatening foreclosure. But something had shifted. For the first time, I wasn't fighting alone. Ellie joined me outside, wrapping a blanket around both our shoulders against the desert night chill. We stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars. "You did good in there," she finally said. Jack would be proud. I thought about all the nights Jack must have stood in the same spot, looking up at these same stars, holding on to his dreams despite all evidence that they'd never come true. "Jack," I whispered, too quietly for even Ellie to hear, "if you're up there, put in a good word for me. I think I'm going to need all the help I can get." The 2 weeks after the town hall meeting passed in a blur of legal meetings, paperwork, and sleepless nights. David's team filed motion after motion, each one requiring a response from my increasingly worried lawyer. My bank account dwindled with each filing, and the foreclosure clock kept ticking. But something unexpected happened during those 2 weeks. The town rallied around me in ways I never could have imagined. Mrs. Henderson from the diner started a Support Tom Reed jar by her register that collected enough to cover one of my legal bills. Old Man Peterson, who owned the local paper, ran a front-page editorial titled Silver Dreams and Community Values that painted my struggle as David versus Goliath, with me, ironically, as David. The turning point came 3 days before our scheduled return to the town council. Ellie was at my kitchen table surrounded by stacks of documents she'd been researching, her reading glasses perched on her nose, hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She'd taken personal days from the library to help sort through the legal maze. "Tom!" she suddenly exclaimed, nearly knocking over a coffee mug. "I found something." She was holding a faded document she dug out of the county archives, her hands trembling with excitement. "Reed Family Holdings wasn't just some informal title Jack used," she explained, pushing the paper toward me. "It was a properly registered family trust established in 1953, with specific provisions for succession. When the mineral rights were transferred to this entity, they became trust property, not personal property." I stared at the document, trying to understand the legal jargon. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means," Ellie said, her eyes bright, "that those rights couldn't be automatically transferred through Jack's personal will. The trust has its own succession rules, which state that management passes to the oldest direct male descendant actively involved in prospecting or mining activities related to the trust properties." My heart skipped. "That would be me." "That would be you," she confirmed. "Not David or Michael. They've never shown any interest in the actual mining, only in the potential profits. According to this trust document, you're the rightful trustee, and you have legal authority over those silver deposits." We took this bombshell to my lawyer, who initially looked skeptical but grew increasingly animated as he reviewed the document. "This changes everything," he said finally. "The trust supersedes the will. If we can prove continuous existence of the trust, and that Jack intended for you to be the successor trustee." The judge's chambers were wood-paneled and somber, smelling of old books and furniture polish. David sat with his legal team on one side of the conference table, looking confident in another expensive suit. I sat on the other side with my loan attorney, wearing the same button-up shirt I'd worn to the town meeting. Ellie waited outside. Only parties to the case were allowed in these preliminary hearings. Judge Harriet Wilson was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who'd grown up in our county and knew most of its history firsthand. She studied the documents before her with piercing eyes, occasionally asking clarifying questions that made even David hotshot lawyers squirm. "This is an unusual case," she finally said, setting down her reading glasses. "On one hand, we have a will that clearly distributed most properties to plaintiffs. On the other, we have a previously dormant but legally valid family trust with specific succession provisions." She turned those piercing eyes on David. "Mr. Reed, did you or your brother ever engage in prospecting activities on the disputed land?" David shifted uncomfortably. "No, Your Honor. We're businessmen, not miners." "And you, Mr. Thomas Reed," she continued, turning to me, "have you actively pursued the mining interests outlined in this trust?" "Yes, Your Honor," I answered, my mouth dry. "I've hired geological consultants, developed environmental impact plans, and worked to create a community center approach to the silver deposits my grandfather identified." She nodded, making a note. "It appears to me that the Reed Family Holdings Trust remains a valid legal entity, and that according to its own governing documents, Thomas Reed is the rightful successor trustee with control over the mining rights to the disputed property." David's lawyer immediately protested, but Judge Wilson held up a hand. "Furthermore, the trust document specifically separates surface rights from mineral rights. The plaintiffs may retain ownership of the land itself, but the silver deposits beneath belong to the trust under Mr. Thomas Reed's management." David's face turned a shade of red I'd never seen on a human being before. It was somewhere between a fire truck and a ripe tomato. His lawyer whispered frantically in his ear, but Judge Wilson wasn't finished. "I'm granting an injunction preventing any mining activity by the plaintiffs, and recognizing Mr. Thomas Reed's authority to proceed with orderly development of the mineral resources as trustee. A full hearing will be scheduled to finalize these findings, but my preliminary ruling stands effective immediately." She gave a sharp rap of her gavel, and just like that, Jack's silver dream became my reality. Walking out of those chambers was like stepping into a different world. The sunlight seemed brighter, the air fresher. Ellie was waiting on a bench, And when she saw my face, she jumped up, her eyes questioning. The trust was valid. I told her, still hardly believing it myself. The mineral rights are mine. David gets to keep the land, but what's under belongs to Reed Family Holdings, and I'm the trustee. She threw her arms around me right there in the courthouse hallway, not caring who saw. Over her shoulder, I watched David storm out with his lawyers trailing behind, none of them sparing me a glance. It took nearly 6 months to get from that preliminary ruling to actual mining operations. 6 months of permits, environmental studies, financing negotiations, and equipment purchases. The town council approved our proposal with conditions about water protection and habitat restoration that actually improved our original plan. I partnered with a mining company that specialized in minimal impact extraction, giving them 30% of the profits in exchange for their expertise and equipment. The agreement included hiring local workers whenever possible and implementing all our community benefit programs. Stan Kowalski came out of retirement to serve as our chief geological consultant, his unlit cigar a constant presence as he supervised the test drilling. The first core samples confirmed what Jack had known 70 years earlier. We were sitting on one of the richest silver deposits found in Nevada in the last century. The vein ran deep and consistently high grade, better even than Stan's initial estimates. I was in the garage, changing the oil in Jack's old pickup, when my phone rang with the news of our first extraction results. The numbers were so far beyond what I'd expected that I had to ask them to repeat everything twice. When I hung up, I sat down hard on the concrete floor, wrench still in my hand, and laughed until tears ran down my face. "Jack," I said to the empty garage, "I'm buying you the best damn beer they serve in heaven, old man." The first royalty payment hit my bank account 2 weeks later. 7 digits. More money than I'd ever imagined having. The second payment was even larger. First things first, I paid off the house and all my debts, including the second mortgage that had started this whole adventure. Then I hired the best restoration team in the state to bring Jack's pickup back to its original glory, every detail perfect from the engine to the paint job. With financial security came the freedom to think beyond survival. Ellie and I had been seeing each other regularly throughout the whole ordeal, our relationship deepening with each shared battle and small victory. Now, with the pressure off, we found ourselves talking about the future, a concept that had seemed like a luxury before. Remember that house we used to pass on Hillside Drive? I asked her one evening as we sat on my porch swing. The white one with the big wraparound porch and the view of the mountains? "The Henderson place," she said. "Of course. I used to dream about living somewhere like that when I was a girl. All those windows facing the sunset." "It's for sale," I told her, try to sound casual and probably failing miserably. "I looked at it yesterday." She turned to me, her eyes widening. "Tom Reed, are you thinking of moving?" "I'm thinking of a lot of things," I admitted, "but I wouldn't want to live in a house like that alone." The way she looked at me then was worth more than all the silver in Nevada. The next day, I made an offer on the house. The day after that, I bought a ring. There's a hill just outside of town where teenagers have been going to watch the stars, share beers, and make out since probably beginning of time. Ellie and I had spent a few evenings there in high school, feeling rebellious as we sipped cheap wine and listened to Tom Petty's Free Fallon on my car stereo. That's where I took her on a clear fall evening, a small velvet box burning a hole in my jacket pocket. I'd packed a proper picnic this time. Good wine, fancy cheese, fresh bread from the bakery in town. We sat on a blanket watching the sun set behind the mountains, turning the sky into a painter's dream of orange and purple. "This feels familiar," Ellie said, smiling as she sipped her wine. "Except the music's better, and we're not worried about getting caught by Sheriff Matthews." I laughed, remembering the time we'd had to scramble down the backside of the hill when the sheriff's cruiser had rolled up unexpectedly. And the wine doesn't taste like battery acid anymore. "We had big dreams up here," she said softly, looking out over the town lights beginning to twinkle in the valley below. "California. Adventure. Leaving our mark on the world." "We still can," I said. Then, before I could overthink it, I slid off the blanket onto one knee, pulling out the box and opening it to reveal the diamond ring inside. Different dreams, maybe, but bigger in some ways. Ellie's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide in the fading light. Ellie Parker, I said, my voice steadied and I felt, I've loved you since you laughed when I stepped on your toes at the spring fling. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? She didn't answer right away. Instead, tears filled her eyes, spilling down her cheeks as she nodded. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. You always were my treasure, you dummy, she said, launching herself at me with enough force to nearly knock us both over. Of course I'll marry you. I slipped the ring onto her finger as Tom Petty sang about free falling to the car speakers, a touch I'd planned, but that felt even more perfect in the moment than I'd imagined. With my personal life settled into a happiness I never thought I'd find, I turned my attention to keeping the promises I'd made to the town. The Jack Reed Memorial Scholarship Fund was established with an initial endowment of $5 million, providing college assistance to local kids interested in environmental science, geology, or mining technology. We set aside another $3 million for desert preservation and rehabilitation projects, working with the same environmental groups that had initially opposed our mining operation. Together, we created a plan to not only protect the existing ecosystem, but improve areas that had been damaged by previous development. The Reed Family Heritage Center broke ground next to the library, designed to showcase the history of mining in the region and provide educational resources for schools and visitors. Ellie took a leading role in developing its programs, her enthusiasm for local history finding a perfect outlet. David and Michael stayed away for months after the court ruling, licking their wounds and probably plotting their next move. But money has a way of changing dynamics, and eventually they showed up at my door one Sunday afternoon, looking uncomfortable but determined. We should talk about a family partnership, David began, all business despite the forced smile. Pool our resources, the land, the mineral rights. Together we could... Stop right there. I interrupted, leaning against the doorframe. I'm not interested in a partnership. David's smile faltered. Be reasonable, Tommy. We're family. We should be working together. Not... Family? I repeated, unable to keep the edge from my voice. Where was family when Jack needed help in his final years? Where was family when you tried to take everything he left me? Michael shifted his weight, looking everywhere but at my face. The past is the past. We're talking about the future now. Millions on the table. I studied my cousins, these men who share my blood but none of my grandfather's values. Then I slowly extended my hand. You're right about one thing. We are family. So here's what I'll offer, a handshake. That's it. They stared at my outstretched hand in confusion. Jack taught me to share, not to take. I explained, so I'll share this. The Scholarship Fund and Heritage Center are open to your kids too. But the business? That stays with the trustee. Have a good afternoon, gentlemen. The looks on their faces as I closed the door was worth more than their proposed partnership could ever have been. That evening, Ellie and I sat on the porch of our new house, the white one with the wraparound veranda and the perfect view of the mountains. Johnny Cash's Ring of Fire played softly from the outdoor speakers we'd installed, the music drifting out over the carefully landscaped yard. I held the old photograph of Jack and me by his pickup, the one that had sat on my garage wall for years. In it, we were both laughing, covered in dust from a day in the mountains, looking like we owned the world. I wish he could see all this, I said, running my thumb over Jack's smiling face. Who says he can't? Ellie replied, leaning her head against my shoulder. I like to think he's up there right now, drinking that beer you promised him, watching us and saying, I told you so. The thought made me smile. Jack had always claimed the stars were just pinholes in the floor of heaven, letting the light shine through. Looking up at the first evening stars appearing in the darkening sky, it was easy to believe he might be peering down through one of them. The real wealth isn't in what you have, I said, remembering Jack's words. It's in who you're beside you. Ellie took my hand, her engagement ring catching the last light of sunset. We did it, didn't we? We actually found buried treasure, like a couple of kids in an adventure story. We found a lot more than silver, I said, putting my arm around her shoulders and pulling her close. The porch swing creaked gently as we rocked, watching the mountains turn purple in the fading light. The same mountains that held Jack Silver all those years, waiting for the right time, the right person. "We made it, kid," I whispered, setting the photo carefully on the small table beside us. Ellie's hand found mine, our fingers intertwining as naturally as they'd been doing for decades. The house behind us was new, the future ahead uncharted. But sitting there with Ellie, I felt something I recognized from those old camping trips with Jack. The quiet certainty of being exactly where I was meant to be,